Hi class, it's Bill Berry here with the last video in the series on data types and conversions. In the previous videos we've covered different aspects of data, that is adding, editing, and deleting it from tables. We talked about data types and went through all the different types you can use in MySQL. And now we're ready to talk about conversions. It shouldn't be a long video, it's a short topic. So let's jump in and get started. So let's see, we want to jump to the slide. Here we go. So in conversions, what we want to talk about here is SQL is able to convert between data types. It can turn a string into a number to a string, etc. It can do that in two different ways. One way is that it can do it implicitly, which means you haven't asked for it, right? You didn't explicitly ask for anything to be converted, but it'll do it for you just because it's trying to be nice and kind, and often that's what you meant anyway. So let's look first at implicit conversions, and then we'll look at explicit. So this is a case, implicitly again, you didn't ask SQL to do this work for you. It just sort of did it as a byproduct or did it on your behalf to be helpful. So these kind of make sense, or at least some of them do. If we concatenate a string and a number, it's going to return a string. So it had to convert this part, right? This is a number. It had to convert this numeric literal to a string so that it could concatenate on the dollar sign. Therefore, the result is going to be a string containing this, but implicitly it had to convert this particular data to a number, or from a number to a string. Now, sometimes it does it in a little bit of maybe unexpected ways. So for instance, when you were going to divide 5346 divided by the text 5346-43-X, if you try to do that, SQL tries to do its best. Now, this is probably not what you really wanted, but it's what it does. It says, oh, you're doing division, therefore you must mean that this part has to be a number. Therefore, I'm going to do my best to convert this into a number. When it does that and it runs into this hyphen, it goes, okay, I don't know what that is, so never mind. So it just sort of ignores all the rest of this and divides this by this and yields an integer 1. Again, maybe that's not what you wanted it to do or what you expected, but it did it on your behalf, and there you go. Another case here, you maybe took a date literal and you said +1. It doesn't yield a date, but in this case it said, oh, you're doing this plus. Plus means addition, therefore I guess you want this to be a number, so it would turn it into a number, and then it would add 1 to it and result in this number as the result of the, what's being going to be shown in the select. So there are plenty of cases where implicit conversion is done. Now notice that some of you guys are using this a lot unintentionally. For instance, if you say in, let's say, select, star from customer where age is greater than 23, right? If you do this, where you make this a string literal, SQL's going to do an implicit conversion for you because it says, oh, this thing's a numeric column, we guess, and you're doing a numeric type of comparison with it, so I better turn this into a number for you. So it's going to implicitly do that conversion and return 23 so that it can then do the comparison. So that's why in some of your homework I've said don't do that, right? If it's a numeric column, use a numeric literal. Why would you make SQL do an extra conversion for you when you know very well how to use numeric literals? So I would recommend not using this, even though it works. It looks weird to the reader because they think that you should know better, and it does cause an extra conversion. We're not that worried about performance, but it just seems odd. It makes the reader think you don't really understand numeric literals. So that's another implicit conversion. There's no sense doing it a lot of the time, like in this case. All right, so next let's look at some ways to explicitly convert. So here are two commands you can use, two functions. There's the cast and the convert. Now they do the same thing, but they have different syntax. And you might see that in the broader world, cast is a little bit more common, right? So if you look at other kinds of SQL, you might see cast more prominently, and maybe convert is not going to be seen as much. But they both do the same thing. There are certain data types that you can convert to with these operations. You can convert to a char, or date, time, or integers, or decimals, right? You can convert to any of these types. And the way that you do it is, if you're going to use cast, you put the thing that you want to convert, and then you have to put the word as, and then you put the data type that you want to convert it to. In this case, it'll convert it to a 10-digit char, which means it will pad it if it needs to with extra digits to make sure that it's exactly 10. Right? So that's an example of a cast. Now convert exactly turns out the same thing, but notice its syntax is different. You put the thing you want to convert, but then instead of as, you put a comma, and then you put the data type. So notice that difference here, right? Instead of as, it's comma, and then you put the data type you want to convert to. So in either one of these cases, you can ask SQL to please convert to a certain data type. So if you ever need that, then that's great, right? You can certainly use it. All right, so the last thing we're going to look at here is going to be string conversions, because there's oftentimes that we want to convert things to strings to use them. So let's look at that. And that example here would be, right, one thing that we have seen before is the format command. And remember that format will implicitly return a string because it has to. Remember, it's doing adornment, right? It's adding things in that are not numeric, like commas. So it has to return a string. So you can say, hey, I want this thing to be a string with 2 digits, so make it pretty and make sure it's 2 digits. Now, that's useful because, let me jump back to our notepad example, that's useful because sometimes you're formatting something that would result in, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? And if you format that for 2, the result of that is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's going to put a comma here, and it's going to put a dot and 0, 0. So you know that regardless of whether it had more digits or less digits, it's going to show 2 digits here, and it's going to return a string, right? So that's a byproduct of format that we need to be aware of. If we're going to continue to do math, or if we're going to do sorting on it, we have to be careful because this is now a string. That'll sort differently than the equivalent number would, so be a little bit careful. So, but format is very useful. Do it at the end though, right? Do it at the end if you need it to look pretty, and then format can be your friend, right? Now, the other thing that we will talk about briefly is the fact that you can use special characters. These are ancient kinds of things that exist in the lower ASCII range, right? They're lower than characters and numbers in the ASCII range, which is how we refer to numbers, or how we represent text inside the computer, right? That's a common way to represent it. And below those numbers, there's a few kind of special characters that are used only for kind of console-y kind of things. So for instance, the 9th character, right, position 9 is a tab, position 10 is a line feed, position 13 is a carriage return. So you can use this to your advantage in some circumstances where you need to insert a tab or a line feed or a carriage return. Please note also that Mac and Windows do a little bit differently with line feeds and carriage returns. Windows uses a pairing, right? It does a line feed carriage return pairing, or carriage return line feed pairing actually, right? Carriage return and then line feed. But on the Mac, you will only see the line feed, and that does the same thing. So that is a little different. The other thing to note is, even though you can do something very clever like this that says, you know, concatenate the vendor name and then put this carriage return line feed and then the vendor address and another one of those, you can do that, but do be aware that Workbench itself, its result pane is basically an HTML format. So any extra white space that you put in is going to be ignored. If you know anything about HTML, that's a common thing that happens. So you won't see this working if you use Workbench, but if you happen to be using a command line interface, which MySQL does offer as well, you can use this and it will actually look right. So this carriage return line feed makes sure that this and this are on 2 separate lines, and so we can make sort of an address label using this. So these are a couple of string conversions that we wanted to make sure that we knew about, even though this last part maybe not as useful because we're working in a Windows environment typically, or even on the Mac, I don't think it shows. All right, so that brings us to the end of this whole topic, this whole series. So we've talked about data, we've talked about data types, and now we've talked about conversions, implicit and explicit conversions that SQL can do for you. At this point, if you're in class with me, there are some things that you might want to do next. There's some quizzes, there's some projects, and so you'll want to read your next chapters and be ready. We'll talk next about designing a database. This is a neat topic, an exciting topic, because we can actually get in and start learning how to create schema. How do we create a database? And so we'll be getting to the code for that later, but first we're going to just talk about the design. How do we conceive of things? How do we look at data that our customers have and decide how we're going to organize it into a database? So it's a great mental exercise and a great way to ensure that we have a firm understanding of how databases work, normalization, primary keys, foreign keys. It'll really lock in some of that stuff. So that's the end of this series. Thanks for watching these videos, and hopefully we'll see you in another future one. Thanks.